Hey everyone, this is Dr. Maples. We're here to finish up our last lecture in our Research Questions lecture series. I want to just give some basic advice to think about when you're dealing with your research questions. These are basic ideas that you can run with to help you develop an existing research question and maybe make it sociological, or it also could just be to check and see if your question is something that you can actually study at this point. Now, the first one is actually that idea. I often get undergraduate researchers who present really cool sociological research questions or just research questions in general, and they're really interesting and they could be really fun to learn about, but they aren't possible with the resources that you have available. This is a problem because you want to make sure that you can ask a question that you can actually answer. Now, the story of that is one of two things. Could you either A, realistically collect the data yourself in the time that you have to write a paper, and B, rather, is this data that already exists somewhere, so you don't have to collect it, you can just analyze it. Now, if either of those is possible, you can take your question, and so long as you make it sociological, you can probably pull it off. But I want to give you some examples of cases where things were either so super broad that there weren't data sets out there, or maybe they were so specific that there weren't data sets out there. In fact, I kind of want to start on the specific end of things. Sometimes my students have very specific experiences that they're interested in, such as divorce rates amongst military families with 2 children or more. And they want to understand how those all play together to shape divorce. It's an interesting question. It could be sociological if you framed it differently, but the more important question is, A, do you have the resources to interview enough military families that have gotten divorces and have 2 or more children? Or B, is there a data set already out there? I can already tell you that for B, no, there isn't. It's just not something that's been explored. Now, it's a great question, and with a little work, again, we could think about the sociological element of it. Another good example would be if you're trying to look at very specific groups and compare them to other groups, like how might a teenager adopted in the Midwestern states differ from someone who was adopted as a tween in Western states? It could be an interesting question. It could be an interesting sociological question with reframing, but the data aren't there. So you're going to have to collect this yourself. And if you don't have the resources to collect it yourself, it's probably not a practical research question. My whole point is that if we don't have access to the data and we can't collect it ourselves, we have to be very careful about saying this is our research question. What we might want to do is instead reframe our research questions to ask the questions that we can answer given the time and the resources that we have available. And when you're at the end of the paper and you're concluding your thoughts on the paper, you can point out that, by the way, this would be a really great topic to explore if you have the resources available to do that and to think about this, and this, and this. And that's kind of the best that we can do sometimes. For many of you, you're going to hear this argument again when you take the 470 class with me in the near future. But that's okay, because we'll still make sure you've got a great question for your thesis. In the meantime, always think about with research questions, is it really something that you can study? Do you have the resources available, the time available, or is just the data set already out there? A couple of other things that come to mind too when you want to improve a question. Take a moment and ask yourself the way you framed the question. Is it in fact, a question, or is it a sentence? That happens more than you'd think, but think about, is your question actually in the form of a question? Is it clearly focused? Are you using really unclear terms or generalized terms like, is poverty shaped by age? Well, what kind of poverty? What do you mean by age? Do you mean age groups? Do you mean, comparing persons over a certain age to people under a certain age? So try to be more specific. We'll talk about that in a moment too. Is it a yes-no question? Yes-no questions are not really research questions. They're just questions. Does it contain relationships? That's really the key thing. If you can look at your question and see a relationship developing between 2 or more variables there, and you can see how they're social or socialization oriented or societal, then you're looking at probably a sociological question. I also want to talk about ways of improving your questions by realizing that they're drafts. All of our questions are just drafts, and it's okay that they change over time. Your first version of your question is very rarely the final version of your question. I've also had cases where mid-study, my research questions have changed. This is actually something we call the paradox of sociology. Paradox of sociology states that for every question sociology answers, it creates more questions. And sometimes those happen within your paper, and so you're able to dig deeper, add more questions, and study that idea. Let's look at a very basic question, not quite a sociological question, but a question nonetheless. Does age influence racist belief? Now, that's probably a decent psychology question. They could study that in individuals, and they'd be pretty content with that. But for sociologists, we want to bring sociology into that. We could answer that question too, by the way, even if it's not a sociology question, but I think we could do more with it. So, for example, we could first off turn it into a sociological question, maybe think about understanding how age impacts racist beliefs, and how the individual might be socialized to have racist beliefs based on when they were born, when they lived, or maybe even their experiences later in life. Now we're very much dealing with the realm of sociology. We could also try to understand too different facets of racism. So we could think about how like persons in a specific group or organization might have increased odds of having racist beliefs. This was actually something that one of our recent graduates did and is publishing that paper. And they did that using publicly available social survey data. It was really exciting paper. They found that based on your political affiliations, it could shape your racist beliefs about very specific things. Not all things, it was interestingly enough found, but very specific things. We could also think too about maybe some of the other relationships at hand. Could older persons who are also affiliated with that particular group have different measures of racist beliefs than people who are not part of those groups? This is actually where we're doing some controls in there. We're now throwing in other variables that might mitigate that relationship. Again, we're getting into the realm of sociology here. We're trying to get a more nuanced question, and we're getting more interesting research that's also more publishable in the end. Again, remember, with many of you, as we work on your theses in the spring, we'll be aiming to try and publish some of these in undergraduate journals. Let's also think, too, about how we might accidentally include bias in our questions. Now, I've included some really obvious examples. Bias isn't usually quite so obvious, so you have to be careful that you haven't brought that into it. But let's look at some really very obvious questions. Why are particular group intelligent? So you're studying something and you're asking why a particular group is unintelligent. Well, do you see how you're already building the assumption that someone is unintelligent? Do you kind of see how that could have some issues in your research because you're framing it that way? Now, if you rephrase your question to say, what are the intelligence levels of a particular group? It's still problematic, but you could establish things like educational attainment for a particular group. The census does that, actually. Maybe we want to improve that, though, and try to bring sociology into it and ask something like, what's the educational attainment level for a particular group, and what variables shape access to education? We can't just assume that they're unintelligent. We can maybe try to understand what are the variables that are shaping that relationship. And we're looking at relationships, so now we're in the realm of sociology. Give you another example. Why is X group so awesome as tourists? This is something that in my research I have to be careful because I think that outdoor recreation users are often very cool and interesting people, but I have to make sure that my research stays unbiased and stays scientific. So what might be better to ask is what's the demographics of a particular group who are visiting a particular area, and what explains their perceptions of the area. Again, we kind of steer clear of preloading what we think we want to find, that these people are awesome, or in the previous question that a particular group is unintelligent. We want to make sure that bias is something that we steer clear of in our research. I want to talk a moment about that too, because remember, as sociologists who are children of the Enlightenment, as all other sciences are, we commit ourselves to remaining neutral in our research. We're not trying to prove an idea because it matches our agenda. We're trying to create scientific empirical knowledge. So remember that at all times. You want to steer clear of trying to prove what you want to be true, and instead focus on just proving what is true and trying to establish new knowledge. All right, that's going to wrap things up for us. Now, look, a great sociological question helps us learn more about groups, about relationships, and about our society. Um, it gives us a really cool opportunity to understand an idea from a really unique direction or a unique angle that has to do with our society. It helps us learn more about how society functions. It sets up testable hypotheses, something that we'll work with in the very near future, and looks at examining relationships between multiple variables. And it helps us explain what's happening in our society. These all go back to the core ideas that Auguste Comte had for sociology from the start about studying these social phenomena, establishing testable hypotheses, and establishing new knowledge about how society functions. Again, I reiterate, thinking sociological is something that comes with time. It's usually not something that you just do automatically. So if you feel frustrated as you try to develop questions, that's okay, that's normal. Post those on Blackboard. Remember, we've got our discussion board assignment set up for this lecture, so you can share some of the ideas and then try to turn those into questions that you love about sociology. And the thing that I think is the most important part to remember is the more you do this, the better you get at it. Again, for many of you, you'll be taking the methods class, and all semester long, we're going to be setting up research questions so that by the time you start doing your theses in the spring, it's going to be a breeze because you're going to know how to set up a research question, you're going to know how to set up a hypothesis, and you're going to know how to make sure it's sociological. So by then, you'll be pros at it like me. All right. No bias introduced into that idea whatsoever, right? All right, so that's going to be it for us on this lecture series. Remember to get on Blackboard and that discussion board, submit your ideas, just things that interest you about sociology, and then try to write a sociological research question about them. It's not for points, there's no judging, we're just starting that process of trying to do this. If you have questions, if you have concerns, if you have technological problems, you know where to find me. Otherwise, I'll see you in our next lecture series. Take care.